This week on Truth in Politics, it's an issue that never goes away. Several weeks ago, we told you the story of Jason Kennedy, who came to Winnipeg from the Bloodvein First Nation for a leg amputation. Staff at the Grace Hospital cut off the wrong leg. And we also have had two recent stories about elderly hospital patients in Saskatoon and now in Edmonton who had had their hair cut by staff without family consent. Our Dennis Ward spoke with Winnipeg Free Press columnist Negon Sinclair and Jennifer Leywitz with Pasqua Strategies about these issues. Here's that interview.
Jennifer Negon, thanks for being here with us as always. Jennifer, we'll start with you. Why do you think we keep hearing stories like this coming out of hospitals?
I think there's a couple of things that are coming into play here, and I don't want to speculate with what entirely happened behind the scenes within that hospital, but I will say that it seems that there is a really big component of discrimination that exists. A lack of cultural understanding is another big one. I think that there's a lot of people out there that don't understand or can appreciate the significance of various different components of First Nations identity and culture, including hair. And I think just, again, it just goes back to that lack of understanding or not even wanting to understand. And that's the place where the discrimination comes in, viewing our people as less than and, not appreciating what makes us who we are. And I think there was a lot of pieces missing into how this could have happened.
Negon, can you talk about the significance of hair for many Indigenous peoples?
Well, we spend a few hours talking about all the different that there's just 640 different communities in Canada and of course 80 different cultural groups. So I mean to encompass it all would be impossible, but I'll just say a few things. So identity is a big part of it. Usually identity is referring to the way in which a familial way that a traditional family dresses their hair, ties their hair. There's a strength, usually shows long hair for men is indicative of a lot of strength, but for a lot of women, it shows a lot of wisdom. But generally, there's this very spiritual significance with hair. For instance, we don't throw our hair away. We burn our hair because it is a sacred part of us, and it's often likened alongside medicine. And so we share that hair with creation when we get it cut. Probably the most significant part is that our bodies are intended to work with creation. Almost every single Indigenous nation culture is trying to create a bigger connection with nature, with the natural world, with all of the universe. And so when we grow our hair, we are resembling creation, particularly that sweetgrass. And that's why we tie that sweetgrass in the same way that we often braid our hair, whether it be as an elder or a knowledge keeper. And that's usually where our hair comes from, our deep connection with the earth. And that's what it's indicative of. So it's something that is very sacred. And when you cut it, like in residential schools or in this case, what you're doing is you're literally cutting us off from our very foundation of who we are, which is our connection with the land.
Jennifer, Dexter Adams of the Pasqua First Nation not only had his braids cut, but his eagle feather and bear grease tossed in a wastebasket at the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Edmonton. Should there be some sort of trainings on the cultural importance of these types of items?
I think training is incredibly important. I know that there's been a lot of questions raised around how this could have happened and if maybe it was rooted in a lack of understanding. But at the same time, I just genuinely cannot wrap my head around how anybody could think that this is acceptable. And I read one news article that the braids and the eagle feather and the medicine were thrown on top of soiled diapers. And to me, how much more clear does it get that there's not only a lack of understanding, but a lack of empathy and appreciation for our people? And all I can think about right now is that family and the community, Pasqua First Nation, on how this makes them feel. Because when you reach the end of life, that's some of the final moments of your life before you are carried on to the spirit world. And I think of my own grandma before she had passed away and how some of my family members took such good care of her in those last moments. And I physically cannot wrap my brain around how anybody would think this is acceptable. And now to hear that the family is still waiting for follow-up, how is this not treated like a major, major incident? Because it is. And yeah, training is the bare minimum, but we also need to start understanding that systemic racism and discrimination exists in all of our areas, including healthcare. And we need better care, and we need our people on the front lines of some of these services so that maybe this can be prevented from happening in the future.
Negan, the hospitals, the healthcare system, they express remorse and vow to stop these things with better training for staff and whatnot. I remember back to the release of the Brian Sinclair report, and I asked, how many people lost their jobs over this? And they said, well, nobody did. Like, is there more that can be done here?
Yeah. The fact that there isn't any retribution, any consequence to kind of this disrespect is just preposterous. But what I would say is that, there needs to be protocols in place, and there needs to be things written by Indigenous peoples working with institutions. People have to put resources, time, effort, hire appropriately to be able to deal with engagements, respectful engagements with Indigenous peoples. I just traveled recently with my sacred items, a pipe and my feathers and medicines. And I know there's been some recent controversy with airline staff, particularly from a certain air company involving the national chief and their headdress a short while ago. But I can tell you that when I went through security in an airport, they uncovered my pipe, they uncovered my medicines and the feather. What immediately happened is they pulled off to the side. They changed their gloves. They asked if they would be able to touch those items. If I had said no, they wouldn't have touched those items. I was dealt with by a supervisor. They were very respectful, and I also felt very seen. I felt appreciated, and they didn't do anything inappropriate with my items. They kept asking. And then, in fact, at the end, the supervisor asked me and said, what is it? Is there a better way that I could do this? And so there's lots of different ways that this can be handled institutionally. And the idea that you would simply just take someone's items and toss them into a refuse bin or a garbage bin, somebody has to be held to account for that. I mean, that's just basic human decency. Never mind the fact that there should be protocols for this.
Well, we wanted to get in some thoughts on the recent AFN Assembly where child welfare again was a major topic. Jennifer, are we any closer to ending the discrimination against First Nations children in the child welfare system?
I'd like to say that maybe we're not as close to the end as we should be when it comes to the discrimination of First Nations kids in care. But I think we're certainly making progress, and I think we have a number of really strong people and organizations across the country to thank for that. The name Cindy Blackstock comes to mind almost immediately. But what we're seeing with the AFN and what is currently making headlines across the country is definitely painting a picture that we're not where we need to be, especially when we hear things like, the AFN is consulting with their lawyers and maybe figuring out ways, allegedly, that they could try to get around resolutions that were passed and things like that. I think, when we see the infighting that we're seeing, the lack of consultation, the pushing out of the grassroots voices like our leadership that are there to speak on behalf of their communities, how do you truly move past discrimination when we've just developed this new system of discriminating against our own voices and which voices are allowed at the table? We saw somebody like Natalie Starlight from Alberta, who was a youth that went up to address the Prime Minister at AFN, and they were saying, well, sorry, he has to go. And it's like, how do you have a youth that's lived through that care and just aged out of it, not be given the time of day to somebody that's the leader of our country that even walked into that space? So I think there's a lot of areas where we're still trying to navigate and create space where our voices are heard, and the kids that are from care or are currently in care are at the forefront of all of the decisions made. And I can't in good conscience say that that's happening when we're hearing what we're hearing and we're seeing what we're seeing, especially out of the AFN.
Yeah, Negan, we're hearing there's legal actions or lawyers getting involved on all sides here. The feds don't seem to have too much to say on anything. Given what everything Jennifer just said there, what are your thoughts on where things are at with this process?
A few months ago, I wrote a column saying the only person that can bring this agreement into some kind of agreement or collaboration, the only person that can bring people together for this agreement is Cindy Blackstock. It is not the national chief, and it is certainly not the AFN. What's happening now is that the AFN has, for one reason or another, chosen that this is the hill they're going to die on, and that they have put their feet deeply, deeply in the earth and said, we are not going to move from our position, and we're going to find any way to hammer this through. This is about the legacy of the national chief, and she feels in one way or another that this is her agreement, or this is her organization's agreement, and so they're going to continue to try to maneuver this. The problem is that there is so much backlash. Most of the chiefs that I know of didn't even go to this gathering because they simply sent a proxy to do one thing and one thing only, which was to vote against it. And I think one of the problems of the AFN is that, as we saw with some of the legal troubles of some chiefs at this gathering, and particularly proxies that represented chiefs, is that the AFN gatherings aren't meant to be places of discussion. They aren't meant to be places in which any real progress takes place. It's meant to be a place in which there's some sort of rubber stamping or agreement given, and if the national chief and the regional chiefs don't get their way, then they simply just push it through. And we saw that with the removal of the previous national chief, and again and again and again. The AFN is not the place in which this agreement is going to take place. And I will just disclose that my father, the late Senator Murray Sinclair, helped mediate this initial discussion, helped mediate this initial agreement. And he witnessed the work that Cindy Blackstock, and while Cindy Blackstock is very stubborn and very difficult to deal with, he had deep admiration and respect. And he told me, as well as I think everybody involved with this agreement will tell you, that it is Cindy Blackstock alone that will help shepherd this agreement into some sort of fruition. And the question will be is whether this government or the next government will be able to still be at the table.
Jennifer, Jordan's principle is another nightmare in waiting. The Fed saying this week that a backlog of 140,000 claims right now that they don't know how to clear. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the government is essentially dealing with a mess that they created themselves. I think that there's a lot of First Nations kids out there who need care, and they need, access to various different services. And a lot of it has to do, I'm sorry, maybe this is a little bit biased, but it has to do with the treatment of those kids over time. And not just that, through generations as well. I was one of those kids where I didn't get diagnosed until my adult years for things like ADHD and OCD and things that were, perhaps maybe not tied to my childhood and deeply affected me. And even now as an adult, I'm like, what effects are those going to have on my kids as well? And are we just perpetuating those same cycles over and over again because of lack of care and adequate access to services? It's impacting generations that come after us. And the government is just kind of like, well, what do you want us to do about it? And it's like, did you not think that through decades upon decades of terrible, terrible government policy that deeply impacted First Nations people, there were going to be massive impacts from that, especially in our youth? And now, there's a backlog. When you need urgent access to services, there can't be backlogs like this because it can literally be between life and death when it comes to treating kids and giving them the access to services that they need.
Niigaan, lastly here, the number of claims filed on an annual basis for Jordan's principle has jumped by more than 80,000 claims in just a couple of years. What are your thoughts on the reasons for the massive increase in claims being made?
Well, I think communities don't have any other way to engage funding, especially in emergency situations. And because Jordan's principle was created on a reactive method, terrible situation, of course, involving the death of a young person, people did move quickly. They moved swiftly to be able to bring funds available for young people to when they encounter the healthcare system, but then also other systems that they'll have access to funding. That funding has now grown, or the access to that funding has grown to include several other things that are not always emergent, but are emergent. I mean, because mental health is emergent. And so the communities really have no other means. These are under-resourced. These are organizations that are dealing with front lines. Sometimes they are non-Indigenous run. They are sometimes Indigenous run, in which they're trying their best to be able to serve children. I know, for example, a family that's trying to get just basic services like asthma dealt with, and just basic things like mental health care services for a young person developed, or basic things like medicine that's for attention deficit disorder. These are things that are crucial for the well-being of young people. And it is the federal government that created this mess, under-resourcing First Nations kids, Indigenous kids across the country. And it is the government that has to take responsibility for not just dealing with Jordan's Principle, but that Jordan's Principle has become a catch-all for all the other services that have been under-resourced.
Jennifer Negon, I guess we'll leave it there for this week. We'll be back next week for what I believe will be the Christmas edition of the panel. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you much. Thanks.